everyone. First of all, again, thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. It is interesting that I was introduced in relation to the work I've done on organizational learning. This is not what I'm going to talk to you about today, however. I'm going to talk to you about another aspect that has been anyway very much significant in the development of my work about organizational learning and communities of practice, which has always been around the notion of power, power relation, and trying to, if you like, reinsert into a very traditional understanding and even appropriation of those new and exciting way of understanding learning, such as, for example, communities of practice theory and situated learning theory, something that was about what's going on in this reappropriation of situated learning theory, particularly in the world of management and in a world of consulting. So that work is obviously something that has been very important to me, but what it is that has been very important to me has always been this studying and understanding of power, power relation, ideological formations, and how they are maintained and reproduced. So arguably this story, the trajectory of the story I want to talk to you today about is maybe associated to what today I was discussing this with some people, and they say, oh yes, you know, that was the debate 30 years ago. Why? Because it is about resistance at work. And nobody today, or very few today, talk about resistance at work. It's something that is problematic, it's something that is often not there, but this is the kind of thing I want to explore. And there is a lot of work actually done that might not be as vocal, if you like, as other things that today we take for granted. Within the trajectory of thinking that I'm going to discuss to you today, which is associated to these main two questions: what is resistance in liberal workplaces, and why do we have it, and why not? And there is, as I was saying, a huge debate around that, which today I want to discuss in relation to this main point. A notion of silence, yeah? A notion of underground noises, and then a notion of open denouncements in the corporations. I'm using here the word corporation because what I want to talk about is the workplace in the Western liberal capitalist places of production, including, therefore, all those new forms associated to knowledge firms and so on and so forth that have become so significant, if you like, in the West. I understand that clearly, and a lot of work has been done in trying to open up to a different understanding of organization that is not only associated to the actual, the actual place, the firm, and that is absolutely fine, and that's why there is quite a lot of research that transbords, if you like, with a new understanding of political economy in trying to consider the different forms of organizing, the different ways in which production has been moved to other places, and forms of resistance are present in other places other than the traditional firm. In this silence, underground noise, and denouncement, I want to discuss at least three, and I hope to do, I hope to really get there, three of these points. Some of you are already familiar with this because some of this has been already published, and to a certain extent it's just, if you like, making explicit a certain set of ideas that are associated to a specific debate in radical political theory. In particular, what we could call the social theory of hegemony, or some have called it the Lacanian left. Now, obviously, the social theory of hegemony, also here in this university, has got some representatives, such as Jacob Thorfing, who's actually professor in this university and has published a distinguished book exactly discussing these various notions. Now, 3 points, therefore: decaf resistance, ethical act as real act of resistance, and I want there a question mark. And then I want to explore the resources of Antigone for rereading the theories of whistleblowing. In other words, open denouncement. Let's get on with it. I know, I've been told already that all the keynote speakers have used a lot of pictures, and I'm afraid I'm also going to use some pictures. The picture you see here is a classic one, is Poezia da Volpedo, and is a classic representative of the open struggle. The struggle, there is no silence at all, is a struggle that in the final remarks of the Communist Manifesto, as we see it, disdain to concede their username. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chain. They have a wall to win. This, how does this leave us? It makes us laugh. Some of us maybe just feel a little, a little tremble in reading this final words. Working men and women of all countries unite. Clearly here I have, you always have to introduce something new. So women here is something I have introduced because it wasn't in the original text. But this is what the kind of resistance I'm talking about, okay? The kind of resistance, the discussion around what is this resistance. There is an oppositional resistance, a resistance that is marked by an opposition and by an antagonism which in this particular tradition, in this particular trajectory, has a very clear status. In other words, is an open collective struggle versus capital and its agents. Now, in the UK and in the United States, there has been, and there is still, a debate associated to that, is the labor process theory. And is a labor process theory who had to come to consider the end of the open collective struggle as something associated to those very, very clear teleological, deterministic, and also voluntaristic ways, which is all the different strands, if you like, of Marxism, and arguably some of what people have called the failure of Marxism itself. When you go and study the labor process, and you go and study what is supposed to be an antagonistic resistance that is supposed to be there because of those specific relation of production, what you have is, what these authors have found, is this. This is, I swear I found this on the web. I couldn't believe my luck. This is, in other words, the studies that have been done in the trying to really understand the mechanism of control, the ideological apparatuses and how they operate, and if there was still present at all this antagonistic presence, if you like, associated to the specific social relations. And as you can see, because of the various studies associated, for example, to the cultural corporate programs or HR, strategic HRM, or everything that has to do with team working, entrepreneurship, and so on and so forth, what we have is a constantly silencing, if you like, of resistance. So this oppositional resistance suddenly disappear from the landscape, and what we have are these employees who are actually happy, or so they seem, to, at least when we see all these studies, of actual empirical research done particularly using ethnographic work, which arguably gives us a certain, I don't know where you stand as a collective in relation to ethnography, but it is one of those methods that for some gives a certain access to reality, at least as it is lived by the subject in the specific locations. Now, we have a withering of collective resistance. Yeah, so it would appear, but is this really so? There has been an article, this is now from the mid-90s, basically going back, sort of struggling. No, resistance is not dead. The workplace, it doesn't have, is not all quiet. There is not silence in the workplace. Actually, there is quite a lot going on, and this quite a lot going on, we can see here in the McDonald worker resistance, is a way ways in which the workers themselves are engaging in act of parodying or satirizing their own condition of production, their own relation of production. So we have all these Nazi and free stickers, we have Mac humor, and so on and so forth. This is just an example of what have been called these new forms of resistance. New forms of resistance that have specific characteristics. They are resistances that are not oppositional in the traditional sense. They are not collective in an obvious sense, as some of the quotes I have here. Rather than looking for patently grandiose and global strategies of insurrection, we may find it instead, so it is interesting, we shouldn't really, let's not bother anymore about that. We should actually find the real resistance in those workplaces, in the commonplaces, cracks and crevices of the intersubjective relations and other quiet subterranean realms of organized life. As you can see, there is a crab or maybe a spider in the crevice. The idea being the resistance, it is still there, it's still present, but it is in the interstices of organized life and presents itself as parody, skepticism, humor. Some people have been developing this notion of design and resistance, but arguably, most obviously, the resistance that have been most developed is cynicism. Yeah? Cynicism has been considered one of those, the free spaces where human dignity shows itself, so that I'm not only a team worker, and I'm not only the shrewd deal maker as I'm supposed to be in the corporate world, but rather I'm someone who with a family, I'm a good man or a good woman. I have that space that says that I'm not really buying into the corporate world. Now, this is all very well, but I would argue, and I have argued with others, that this is a decaf resistance. In other words, it's a resistance that is sweetened. It's a resistance that doesn't have the acid. That's what the caffeine, the actual process of adulteration. That's what the coffee actually, the way it's treated. Coffee is, the acid of the coffee is actually taken away. So it's an acid that is not there anymore, and it cannot destroy the machine of power. In this sense, it's a sweetened resistance. It's a resistance that doesn't threaten anyone. Clearly, I don't want to put it down altogether. It is obvious that offers those spaces, if you like, of human dignity and so on and so forth, but it is exactly those spaces of human dignity that make possible for the system to perpetuate itself, also with the very exploitation that the system requires. So this is a quote by Zizek. All this, if you like, carnivalesque, humoristic, but also, to a certain extent, descends from this quote, cynicism, far from undermining the rule of law, its transgression, in fact, serves as its ultimate support. So it is not only that the transgression relies on presupposes the law it transgresses. Rather, the reverse case is much more pertinent. Law itself relies on an inherent transgression, so that when we suspend this transgression, the law itself disintegrates. A classic, arguably, one of those things that really threaten, that is very much a classic in industrial sociology is, for example, over-identification, trying to work to the rule, trying to really do only what you are supposed to do. And that often is the very thing that put in danger the very reproduction of those relations. I don't want to go too much into details on this. I think it is pretty clear, and there is also, if you like, a certain intuitive notion to the term decaf resistance. So is that it then? I mean, we are back to, yes, all those underground noises, but nothing more than that. So does that mean the resistance? By resistance, the notion of resistance is very interesting, because resistance always has these traces of this antagonism. let's consider the fact that some people talk about misbehavior, and how much misbehavior is just not the same as, as using the name resistance. Yeah? So using the name resistance and maintaining this notion of resistance, unless it is marked by decaf, is still somewhat portraying this notion that there is not really an issue for us to actually reconceptualize what's going on and reconceptualize what is very negativity and antagonism and what it means and how, what are the conditions of possibility of its realization, okay? And this is why I originally wrote that piece. I didn't want to put down or look down at those forms of resistance. Not at all. That wasn't the point. The point was to actually make clear, if you like, talk to the community, yeah, talk to those writing about these debates, and really, in order for us to interrogate ourselves on the very impossibility of that notion of resistance, and therefore how can we conceptualize that impossibility and move forward, if at all, yeah? Now, my way, I hate the moving forward, actually. Sorry, I'm ashamed that I've said this word moving forward, because it is a little bit management speak, and I'm sorry. It must be my MBAs, the channel themselves in me sometimes. The ethical act. The ethical act is the place some people have gone in order to start rethinking this notion of oppositional resistance. In other words, a resistance that doesn't just work as the transgression, whatever way, official or unofficial, yeah, or in the interstices of power, but rather something that momentarily suspends the very socio-symbolic as well as affective set of relations, yeah? And by momentarily upsetting it, makes possible for everyone to recognize the moment of power, in other words, make possible to recognize the moment of contingency, and therefore the moment of hegemonic possibilities, of developing things in a new way, of refounding those very relations, okay? This ethical act, which Zizek calls the real act, is supposed to do this act that actually suspends the symbolic order, the socio-symbolic order. Some people have considered this act something of a childish, silly, ridiculous thing that is associated to existentialist notions, and therefore, old stuff again, something that, is just nothing worth developing. I thought that Zizek's point might be contradictory, might be difficult, and actually, you know what, it's also, saying, well, maybe I wasn't really right. But I found this fascinating, and I wanted to go and see exactly where this comes from, what is this all about? So I went to actually read the ethical act, and what it means, where Zizek got this from. And he got this from a book by Jacques Lacan, who's written this work on the ethics of psychoanalysis, which is Seminar 7, okay? In the ethical act, for Lacan, is not it's basically an utterly non-pathological act. So it's an act that it is done, pathological in the sense, in the Kantian sense, yeah? So it's not an act that is done in relation to the consequences. It doesn't consider the consequences at all, but is an act that risks everything. Risks the very being, risks the very subjective, if you like, existence of the person, the individual, the groups, the agent, in their moment acting, okay? So, as you can see here, while the decaf resistance is a resistance without a cost, because you're not really risking the very relations in which you are situating, the ethical act, in this sense, would be a resistance that completely assumes the cost of the possibility of changing completely the very organization, if you like, of the socio-ideological field. Yeah? So it was a very interesting set of propositions, I thought. And in reading this, one of the main figure, one of the main images of this ethical act in the seminar 7 is Antigone. Antigone is, as many of you know, is a Greek, is part of a Greek play written by Sophocles. And Antigone is a woman. Her spirit is obviously still here. Antigone is a woman, and her story is a story I just want to talk you briefly about. This painting, I don't remember the actual author, I found it again on the web, and, but it clearly depicts what Antigone's story is. Antigone is, her brother, Polynices, has been killed in battle against his brother. And Creon, the king of Thebes, the king of the city where Antigone is, decides that he just doesn't want Polynices to be honored in death. Okay? So while his brother is going to receive all the honors, Polynices is going to be denied that. Antigone just cannot bear that. She cannot bear the edict. She cannot bear what the king has decided. So she goes and does the act of basically honoring the death of her brother. And here is the gesture. You know, the act is the act of putting earth on his body, covering his body, which instead was supposed to be left to rotten and to be eaten by birds, and therefore deny the very moment of signification of humanity, the fact that we bury our dead. Yeah? And that marks a difference with animals. That is denied to Polynices. Now, Antigone, she does this. She does it twice. So she doesn't only do once. She actually does it twice. She knows that whoever does this is going to be condemned to death. Okay? She does it twice. She's found. The second time she's seen. So she's brought to Creon, and Creon just, the chorus cannot believe this. Oh my God, is it possible that Antigone has done such a thing? Creon is completely baffled, but at the same time, actually, he asked her, have you done this? Is it what you did? And she says, I wouldn't deny it, I admit it. So even in front of the king, she admits the act. She could have, lied. Her sister tried many, many times to dissuade her and so on and so forth, but she doesn't. She just goes there, she accepts. She takes totally the consequences of whatever happened. The consequences to her are not important. She's ready to die. Actually, she's already dead. By doing that, she's already entering the place in between two deaths. Yeah? And in fact, Creon decides to actually condemn her to be buried in a cave with a little food, and that's it, alive. So she will, in death, she will live. Or in life, she's dead. But we have it both ways. Now, what does that have anything to do with us and with resistance, etc.? Well, let me say that, first of all, Antigone is one of those images that has reverberated. That's why I said the spirit, because actually there is a spirit of Antigone, a spirit that has been called the spirit of anti-authoritarianism, for example, of feminism anti-authoritarianism, of feminist impulse. This is something that has been used quite a lot, for example, by Irigaray. She has developed an interesting analysis of Antigone's role, but also Judy Butler Roskilde has written a book, Antigone's Claim, exactly trying to unravel this feminist impulse in Antigone. And I'm going to use some of the things she says. Now, another important point that also relates to us is the fact that Antigone is also the emblematic whistleblower. In management education, and you teach me, Antigone is actually used as one of those examples that is always given to MBA students to actually work out the different ways in which two rights, for example, fight against each other. Yeah? The moment of, if you like, the openness where two goods are fighting against each other. Antigone represents that. And you find, now in Satcher, for example, you have this new book, which is teaching morality to leaders, or something like that, or to that effect. And that's exactly the way she portrays it. In a number of textbooks, you will see Antigone as one of the cases, yeah? The case study, Antigone. So I thought it has a very strong validity as a way to discuss whistleblowing, exactly because always already in the understanding of whistleblowing, so not only management education, yeah, but also, for example, in many pieces in the Journal of Business Ethics, you will find Antigone as one of the figures that represents whistleblowing. So within this trajectory, and bracketing, yeah, the fact that we accept that there is such a relation. Okay, so I don't want to discuss here, is it so or not? Let's accept it for these purposes. Antigone whistleblower is actually something that I want to suggest is very different from what has come to be considered as Antigone in management studies, and in particular, what I would call a very conservative understanding of the play, and a very conservative understanding of the way social relations are reproduced, and the way morality and the law function, okay? And I want to discuss, I think I have the time, I was really, and I want to discuss a little bit some of these aspects, yeah? Just to introduce some of the elements where there is this difference, and there is this, if you like, this modification that I think it could be potentially very interesting for rereading and proposing an understanding of whistleblowing that is rather different from the conservative way in which it is actually being produced, yeah? Now, let's start with, I have divided the two because this is the way they are divided. Not because they are, in these theories, they are put apart. I mean, these theories, I say conservative because a lot of these ideas are based in the original reading of Antigone that we find in Hegel. Yeah, and that's what they do. They tend to reproduce the distinction that Hegel thought was in place and argued that was in place between what Creon represents and stands for and what Antigone represents and stands for. Consider that one of the things that I want to suggest and to support is that the very notion of representation is extremely problematic. And what we are going to see is that exactly this representation is never so pure. So what I want to show here is that there is a complete impurity in this distinction, yeah? And that this neutrality is not at all present. Okay, the law of kinship and family against the human law and the state. In other words, Creon is supposed to represent the law. The law as this kind of neutral moment whereby the different rights and wrongs are regulated in a specific social ensemble. So arguably, he is doing what he's doing, and he also says it, he's doing what he's doing because he wants to mark the difference that there is between one who's actually fighting for thieves and one who's fighting against thieves. So even if it's not prescribed, the fact that who dies in battle then shouldn't be recognized in death, there is no such a thing. But he decides he wants to do that because he wants to mark a difference. But Lacan suggests that such a difference, yeah, such marking, is always already excessive. It's always already too much. There was no need for that.
what this Creon Act is pointing and telling us is of something more than just putting the law in place, maintaining the law, representing the law, embodying the law. In other words, Creon, rather than just making and embody the law, is excessive in his decision. He wants to kill someone twice. The guy is already dead. That's it. Why do we have to? So there is much more to this. There is almost some kind of vendetta, if you like. There is a desire that goes beyond the very necessity of the law. So what is this saying to us? It's not saying to us that Creon is dead. It's saying to us that the law itself is always already excessive. The law itself is always already based on this violence, on this moment that is beyond what is somewhat justifiable. Antigone is supposed, so in that sense, this representation of human law not only is not clear, exactly because we have this excess, but this excess, rather than simply